It is the autumn of 1940, and somewhere in a quiet sorting room on the outskirts of London, a postal censor holds an envelope up to the light. On the surface, there is nothing remarkable about it. The handwriting is neat. The address is plausible. The postmark is correct. To any ordinary eye, it is just one of the millions of letters passing through Britain's wartime postal system every single week. But this censor is not looking at the handwriting. He is not reading the address. He is looking at something far smaller, far easier to miss. A second postage stamp, pressed just slightly too firmly against the corner of the envelope, its gum disturbed in a way that no legitimate letter would ever show. It is not a dramatic clue. It does not scream espionage. It is, by every measure, an almost invisible detail. And yet, in that moment, the censor knows. He knows that beneath that stamp, concealed between the paper fibers and the adhesive backing, there is a message, written in secret ink or encoded in microdot form, or perhaps simply typed onto a piece of tissue so thin it could pass for nothing at all. He knows because British intelligence has spent years learning exactly how German handlers instruct their agents to communicate. He knows the signs. He knows the tells. This is the story of how a tiny piece of sticky paper became one of the most reliable signals in the whole of Britain's wartime counterintelligence effort. It is the story of how MI5's postal censorship operation, working in near total secrecy from a network of stations across the country, cracked open the communication channels of nearly every German spy operating on British soil. And it begins not with a grand battle or a dramatic arrest, but with a very simple question. If you needed to hide a secret message inside a letter, and you knew your enemy was watching, where would you put it? The answer, for the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, was almost always the same, and that predictability would prove fatal. To understand why the stamp mattered so much, you have to understand the scale of the problem facing Britain in the years between 1939 and 1942. German intelligence had been attempting to place agents inside the United Kingdom since before the war began, and by the time the conflict was fully underway, the Abwehr had dispatched dozens of operatives across the Channel, many of them arriving by parachute, others by fishing boat or neutral shipping. Their mission was consistent: report on troop movements, airfield locations, coastal defences, and civilian morale. Feed information back to Hamburg or Madrid or Lisbon, cities that served as relay points for communication with Berlin. The problem, from Germany's perspective, was that Britain's postal censorship network was already in place. The War Office had established the Imperial Censorship Organization at the outbreak of war, and it was not a small operation. By 1941, the censorship stations at Liverpool, Bermuda, Trinidad, and several sites within Britain itself were employing somewhere in the region of 10,000 people. Examiners, chemists, photographers, translators, and intelligence analysts, all dedicated to one task: reading other people's mail. Every letter passing between neutral countries and Britain was subject to examination. Every parcel, every postcard. The sheer volume was staggering. At its peak, the Bermuda station alone was processing upwards of 200,000 pieces of mail per week, each one opened, examined, photographed, resealed, and sent on its way with no trace of interference. The censors were extraordinarily skilled. They had to be. A letter that arrived with a broken seal, or a slightly mismatched postmark, would alert the agent that his communications were compromised. The entire operation depended upon invisibility. What the Abwehr did not fully appreciate, not in the early years at least, was that British intelligence was not merely reading the letters, it was cataloguing them. building a picture, learning patterns. Every quirk of a known agent's writing style, every turn of phrase, every peculiarity of their tradecraft was recorded and cross-referenced, and one of the most persistent patterns they found was the stamp. The concealment technique was elegantly simple, which is precisely why it was so widely used. An agent wishing to send a secret communication would compose an entirely innocent cover letter, a note to a fictional relative, a business inquiry, a social pleasantry, and post it to a cut-out address in a neutral country, typically Portugal or Spain, from where it would be forwarded to Germany. But the real message was not in the letter itself. It was under the stamp. The method varied, but the principle was consistent. The agent would steam open a used stamp from a legitimate letter, write their true message on the paper beneath, using either secret ink or, in the most sophisticated cases, a microdot no larger than the full stop at the end of this sentence, and then reaffix the stamp. In the case of a fresh stamp, the agent would apply it to a small square of tissue paper first, allow it to dry, and then mount the whole assembly onto the envelope. To the untrained eye, and even to a casual censor working quickly through a large batch of mail, it was undetectable, but it left traces. The gum was rarely perfectly uniform after a second application. The stamp sat fractionally proud of the envelope surface. Under ultraviolet light, the edges showed faint irregularities. And crucially, certain agents, insufficiently trained, under pressure, or simply careless, used the same method on every single communication they sent. They had been told it was secure. They trusted the technique, and that trust was the Abwehr's undoing. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. MI5's Section B1A, led by the brilliant and ruthlessly methodical Thomas Argyle Robertson, known to almost everyone simply as Tar, had by late 1940 achieved something that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. They had turned virtually every German agent operating in Britain into a double agent, or had identified and neutralized them before they could cause any serious damage. The operation that emerged from this effort, known to history as the double-cross system, is one of the most celebrated achievements in the entire history of intelligence. But it depended at every stage on interception, and interception depended on the censors knowing what to look for. The stamp was not the only detection method, of course. The chemical examination of letters for secret ink was a parallel and equally sophisticated science, conducted by teams of chemists at the censorship stations who would expose letters to heat, ultraviolet light, and a battery of chemical reagents to reveal writing invisible to the naked eye. The Germans used a range of formulations: pyramidon dissolved in alcohol, certain common medicinal substances that produced reactions under specific conditions. And the British chemists catalogued every one they encountered, building a reference library of enemy methods that grew more comprehensive with each new discovery. But the stamp examination had a particular advantage. It was fast. A trained examiner, running a finger along a batch of envelopes, could identify the telltale irregularity of a reapplied stamp in seconds. It required no laboratory, no chemicals, no special lighting. It was a tactile skill, almost intuitive after sufficient practice. The slight resistance of too much gum, the faint crinkle of doubled paper. In a sorting room handling thousands of items per day, that speed was everything. The Germans made consistent attempts to improve their concealment techniques as they began to suspect that some of their communications were being read. By 1941, the Abwehr's technical section in Hamburg had developed a microdot process that reduced a full typewritten page of text to a dot roughly 1 millimeter in diameter, virtually invisible without magnification. It was, in the estimation of J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, who encountered the technique through a separate chain of discovery, the enemy's masterpiece of espionage. The British censors first formally identified the microdot in transatlantic mail and subsequently developed a protocol for detecting the minute disturbance a dot caused in the paper fibers of an envelope. Another tiny tell, another imperfection in what was meant to be perfect concealment. Compared with the British operation, Germany's own postal censorship efforts were more bureaucratically organized but operationally narrower. The Abwehr relied heavily on diplomatic channels and neutral country cutouts rather than attempting to build the kind of mass mail examination infrastructure that Britain maintained. Germany did operate censorship stations, notably at Hamburg and later at sites across occupied Europe. But their primary intelligence value was political and economic surveillance, rather than the systematic counter-espionage work that made Britain's operation so formidable. The Americans, for their part, did not establish a comparable mass censorship infrastructure until well after Pearl Harbor, when the Office of Censorship was created in December 1941. Even then, American methods initially lagged behind British practice. It was British expertise, shared through close liaison between MI5, the Secret Intelligence Service, and their American counterparts, that accelerated the development of effective American censorship and counterintelligence examination techniques. The legacy of what happened in those sorting rooms is difficult to overstate. The double-cross system, fed in part by intercepted communications and sustained by the ability to monitor what double agents were reporting to their German handlers, produced some of the most consequential deceptions of the entire war. The great strategic fictions fed to Germany, that the D-Day landings would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, that the Allied order of battle was twice its actual size, that certain phantom armies existed in eastern Scotland preparing to strike Norway. All of it depended on the Germans trusting their agents, and the Germans trusted their agents because those agents had been communicating successfully for months or years. Their messages getting through, their information apparently believed. What Germany never fully grasped was that the channel was controlled from the British end and had been almost from the beginning. The stamp, in this context, was not merely a detection method, it was a keyhole. The moment a censor identified that telltale irregularity, and the letter was referred to MI5, an agent's entire network was potentially exposed. His handler's identity, his communication protocols, his dead letter drops, his cover address. All of it could be extracted from the method and content of a single intercepted message. And once you controlled the agent, you controlled the information he provided. Once you controlled the information, you controlled what Germany believed. And in wartime, what your enemy believes can be more powerful than any weapon in your arsenal. Today, some of the documents relating to Britain's wartime censorship operation remain partially restricted, though a substantial body of material has been released to the National Archives at Kew, where researchers can examine the administrative records of the Imperial Censorship Organization, the technical reports produced by its chemistry section, and the cross-referenced intelligence summaries that linked censorship discoveries to MI5's running of double agents. The double-cross files themselves, the XX committee minutes, the individual agent case files, the deception planning records, are among the most studied documents in British intelligence history. There is no museum display dedicated to the postal censorship operation, no reconstructed sorting room, no glass case containing a letter with a stamp that concealed a secret. The people who worked in those stations, the tens of thousands of examiners and translators and chemists, most of them women, most of them sworn to secrecy for decades after the war ended, left almost no public record of what they had done. They went home. They did not speak about it. The official secrets that bound them were not lifted in their lifetimes in many cases. But the work they did shaped the outcome of a conflict that killed tens of millions of people. A second stamp, pressed a fraction too firmly. A slight irregularity in the gum. A trained finger running along an envelope in a quiet sorting room in the autumn of 1940. It was not glamorous work. It was patient, methodical, repetitive, and utterly vital. The spy who thought his message was hidden discovered, too late, that the hiding place was the most conspicuous thing about it. And in the silence of a censorship station that no longer exists, in a building whose purpose has long since been forgotten, that discovery changed everything. The extra stamp told MI5 what was inside. What was inside gave Britain control of what Germany believed, and what Germany believed lost them the war.